Think fast. Threat level X is your step counter for your X axis. So as I move on the X axis, it increases a lot. When I go on the Y axis, the Y step counter increases a lot. Now, when it increases above a certain threshold, you get into an encounter randomly. And the step counters reset to 0 after a battle. So, if you freeze the values below the threshold, for this room the threshold is 1100. So as long as it remains below 1100, I'll never get into an encounter. So I froze the values here, so I'll just run around a bit and I will never get into an encounter. Now if I remove the freeze, and then move slight amount till it reaches 1100, you didn't see it reach 1100, it might be a little bit below 1100. Anyways, get into encounter immediately. So what you gotta do is keep your step counter to be below the threshold of the area you're in. So the first thing you can do is use skates. As you can see, the step counter doesn't go up. You can be like, woo, and it doesn't go up. It goes up when you turn, and every time it goes up it does a check, but as long as you're below the threshold, you're fine. The second thing you can do is use invisibility. It does nothing to decrease the number of steps you take. It goes up as much as it does. However, the threshold is increased about 4 times, so you can do 4 times more movement before you get into an encounter, roughly. So once it gets above 4400, it'll start randomly checking, and eventually I'll get into an encounter. Actually... Alright, let's reapply. We move around a bit, and it took a while to get into an encounter, but there we go. So those are the 2 things you can do to, you know, prevent encounters. But didn't do a good job there, because, you know, I was just running around. However, using them in combination, you can actually go through a dungeon without any encounters, as we will see. So again, using rollerblades to not increment my step counter. It goes up a bit because of the various movements I do. And the threshold of this dungeon is 800, so I want to keep my step counter below that. Right now it's about 420 or whatever. So I want to reset it. By leaving the dungeon and re-entering it counts as changing the area, and it resets the step counter, so I'm back to 0. Alright. Great movement. So, get used to rollerblades, I guess, if you want to do anything with this game. It's a great sound. So again, want to keep it below 800, so use the watch, it's faster than backtracking. And back to the rollerblades. And if you played this game, you know the rollerblades, you can't change your direction until you run into anything. So there's a lot of running into walls, but it takes less time than getting an encounter, so it's worth it. So I'm getting close to 800 at this point. I gotta move the statue all the way across the room. Luckily, when you're moving an object, the step counter doesn't increase. But I've now crossed the threshold. So now I want to use invisibility. So now the threshold's around 3200, maybe a bit more. So that basically means we have 3200 steps we can take before we have a possibility of getting into an encounter, and right now we're 1200, so we have 2000 spare steps at this point. But this is a fairly long dungeon, so we still want to use the rollerblades whenever we can. Great movement. And this room, there's no encounters, which means the step counter doesn't increment, So whenever there's a room with no encounters, you can move about freely without, worrying about screwing yourself. And reapply invisibility whenever you can, because if you move once non-invisible, do a check, and you will probably be well above the threshold and get into encounter. And ignore me circling over that statue. So this is another room with no encounters, so again, free movement. So obviously, the movement isn't exactly optimized at this point, but it gets the job done. No encounters, etc. Now ideally we finish the dungeon with just below 3,200 steps, which means we moved without using the road blades as much as possible. Because it's slower to use the road blades, obviously, because you're running into everything. Invisibility, move away from the stairs because that makes sense. And this is the final room with encounters. So we finished this dungeon at 2,400. So we had about 800 steps we could still play with. And this is the great puzzle of flipping every switch. And it turns out that's the only solution. Encounters in all these rooms, so free movement. And now a boss. And I have 1 HP. Luckily, I know of a way to set his HP to 0 by using memory editor. Yay! So this part is a cheat. Just setting his HP to 0, and oh, no magic, so I'll just use a regular attack even though it does 0. It does a check every time, even if you do no damage. So it's his HP was 0, so he died. Yay! Instant kill. Not legal in an actual run, but... And that's 0 encounter Dingel. However you pronounce it. And most dungeons, if not all, of the dungeons that you have rollerblades for, you can get 0 encounters. So that obviously saves a lot of time and gets rid of a lot of the RNG. But yeah, that's how the system works.